So I'm going to talk about ethical considerations in neuroimaging, although, as you'll see, very little of what I'll talk about is actually specific to neuroimaging for reasons that I'll discuss. And so you might wonder, why we even allocated an hour to ethical considerations. Do you really need to know about ethics? And maybe if you think about ethics as sort of like as a discipline, right, in the sense that like there's people who study ethics and they have all these kind of frameworks and so on. You might think that, well, intuitively you might think the answer is yes, right? Because of course, how would we know what's right if we didn't at least occasionally stop and think about it? So surely having ethicists seems important, but on the other hand, it's not really clear. And I should mention I'll post the slides later, so don't worry about they're not available right now. I'm making little tweaks. But it's not really clear, right, to what extent our moral views actually reflect deliberative reasoning, if you think about it, right? I mean, there's something to be said for the idea that a lot of our sort of justifications are post hoc. We make a decision and then we rationalize it. Most people, strangely enough, seem to get by okay without having read Mill or Kant or famous ethicists, which again might suggest that maybe you don't really need to know what deontological ethics is in order to make reasonable decisions in the real world. The same is true for, I think, our sociocultural context, right? Cultural norms about what's right and what's wrong change over time, but ethical frameworks have been around for a long time. It's not like somebody woke up one morning and said, oh, we discovered like an unpublished manuscript of Mill's and stop the press. We need to completely change our legal system now to account for this, right? I mean, we seem to do okay, or at least whether or not we're doing okay, we seem to sort of proceed on a track that's fairly independent of what professional ethicists have been talking about for a long time. And to be honest, it's not even clear that ethicists are any more moral than the rest of us. So there's this literature that people like to allude to, mostly as a joke, that kind of shows that ethicists are not more moral than us. This is really sort of, this is fun more than serious. But for example, ethics books seem to go missing from libraries more often than non-ethics books. Now, there's lots of explanations for this besides ethicists are unethical. But there's quite a bit of evidence like this suggesting that at the very least, observationally, studying ethics does not seem to make you a better person on some measures at least. Having said that, there is also evidence. So I tweeted yesterday about this, and someone posted this study which just came out. And it was a really nice study, actually. It was a randomized controlled study showing that tentative evidence, at least, that maybe ethics classes do influence at least some kinds of student behavior. And so maybe ethics does matter. But in any case, I'm just setting the stage to like make it clear that we have an hour here. I'm not going to turn anyone into a more moral person. That's not really the goal. I don't think that's reasonable or feasible. I'm not necessarily even trying to convince anyone to care more about ethical considerations. I think that's also hard. What I want to do is something much narrower. So I want to provide just a very brief overview of issues, frameworks, and applications. And this will be kind of a caricature given the constraints, but just maybe to give you a little bit of an idea of like how people think about broad questions regarding morality and ethics. And much of this will be familiar to many people probably. And really then I want to focus on sort of leading up to maybe a couple of not dramatic, but a couple of sort of practical suggestions that might help at least some people some of the time make maybe decisions that sort of improve your quality of life a little bit, slightly, right? So this is a modest goal. And then lastly, I would like to use up an hour of time on the schedule because this is actually not true. We had plenty of content, so the ethics is there because we think it's important. And so I'm glad that actually a lot of you are here for that. Okay, so let's start by asking, like, if I say, like, what are ethical issues in neuroimaging? Like, what are the actual issues? What do you come up with? And if we were doing this in person, then I would open it up for suggestions and make a list. But we can't really do that efficiently here, so I will just step through some issues. And this is not an exhaustive list, but some issues that come up when we think about like what we as neuroimaging researchers should be thinking about and be sensitive to. So like one obvious one is privacy and confidentiality. And there's nothing unique or special necessarily to this in the neuroimaging context, right? Where we always should be worried about like how we're storing our participants' data, making sure that other people don't get access to any information that participants wouldn't want to be released. There are some unique concerns in the sense that some kinds of imaging data are inherently identifying, right? Like MRI scans, if you don't skull strip them properly, you potentially can look at an MRI scan and actually recognize a person. So there are some differences in that our data are potentially more sensitive, but the broad issues are sort of the same as they are in other domains. Another class of issues, again, that's general but has some specific implications in neuroimaging, has to deal with informed consent. Like, how do we approach the consent process? We want to make sure that people are informed accurately about what's going to happen to them. We want to make sure they're not coerced, but we also respect their decisions as human beings, right? They are autonomous individuals who can make choices, provided they have the information about what they want to do. One, again, unusual aspect of imaging is that if you've collected imaging data, you'll know that sometimes participants actually show up because they're actually looking to have their brain scanned, right, without paying a lot of money for that. And so that raises interesting ethical issues, like what are your obligations towards people who are worried there might be something wrong with their brain, or what happens if incidentally you find something? And very different institutions go different ways on this issue. Another issue is diversity and inclusivity, right? So this you can think of in two ways. One, with respect to the populations we study, right? We don't just want to study rich white people, undergraduates, because then the benefits of our research are really attuned to only some segments of society. We want to make sure that the public is funding our research, and all of the public should get the benefits. And on the personnel side, on the researcher side, we also want to make sure that everyone feels welcome and everyone has a chance to contribute, and we have diverse representation among the research base as well. Again, nothing specific here to neuroimaging, except some fields might have better or less representation, might study narrower or broader populations, but the broader issues, again, are sort of similar. Then we get to some issues that are specific to neuroimaging, so, and have to do with technology. And most of these have to do in one way or another with brain decoding, right? With the idea that at some point soon, we might be able to put people in the scanner and at least for some kinds of context, read off their mental states, their feelings, their thoughts, whether they're lying or not, right? Whether they were at the scene of a crime 3 years ago, et cetera. And so there are an interesting set of implications there that are only starting to be, I think, very serious kind of issues. There's research integrity and reproducibility issues. Russ Poldrack, if you saw his talk just now, talked a lot about this, so this is a nice segue. So I won't kind of dwell on this, just to make the point that there are many things we do or don't do as researchers that influence the integrity and reproducibility of our research, and there are often conflicts we face about whether we should do something or not. And lastly, one that if we were going to talk more about individual issues, I would maybe spend a little time on, because I think we don't tend to think about it much, is stewardship of public resources, which is to say, it's easy to have the mentality that, like, I have this research funding, or I have, my advisor is paying my salary, and so I just do my job and I don't have to think about whether that's what the outcome of that is. But arguably, we are stewards of public resources, and you kind of maybe once in a while should worry about whether you're using the money responsibly, as opposed to just chasing down whatever question seems interesting to you, because there might be someone else in the pipeline who would use that money or those resources differently in the public interest, and so on, right? So there's many other issues that arise. I'm not suggesting this is an exhaustive list. Now, all of these issues are serious and deserve careful study, and many people dedicate their careers to each of these. The problem here is we only have 1 hour, and so in thinking about like what to talk about, I didn't kind of want to pick and choose and just like focus very narrowly on one kind of one specific issue. And so the clever solution I came up with is I'm just not going to talk about any of them. Instead, what I'll do is focus on cross-cutting themes. So general considerations, and maybe then picture like one example of how this might play out for early career researchers in particular, which I suspect many of you are. So I will emphasize, I'll give examples, that ethical and moral problems are actually quite common in research. They're more common than you might think if you sort of think of it as like, oh, that's an IRB thing, right? And then I'll sort of focus on the question of what kinds of considerations do we draw on to make moral decisions? What do some major ethical frameworks have to say, if anything? If we look at the kinds of justifications we provide for why we make decisions, are they defensible? Should we believe ourselves in some sense? And then lastly, what can we do to improve, however slightly? Again, we should have modest goals here, but are there like things we can maybe try to do that might improve our ethical, moral decision making a little bit? So that's sort of the game plan. So the first thing to note is that ethical and moral problems really are everywhere. And intuitively, you might think that these kinds of decisions don't happen that often. They're the kind of thing like, okay, you're designing a study, you kind of have to think about like, is this beneficial to participants? Are there specific concerns? But really, ethics, sure. Like when I write an IRB proposal, and if I'm thinking about robbing a bank or something, then maybe I should there's some internal struggle there. But like, how often do these kinds of issues really come up? But actually, I would argue most of us solve, or at least preempt, several moral dilemmas before breakfast every day, right? And that's true even if we just stick to research-related problems. But we don't often realize this because we actually solve most of our sort of issues really quickly, almost automatically. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm not saying you should start thinking very, like hours and hours about every little tiny detail. That would actually be probably bad. But it's good to be aware that there are constantly problems we face that do have, or when viewed through a certain lens, some moral or ethical implications. So I'll give examples that will probably be familiar oh, sorry, I just saw a question. Yes, I'll share the slides. Yeah, I think I already addressed that later. So I'll just give examples, and many of you will probably recognize some of these. So here's one. Your advisor wants you to drop some analysis from a paper because it'll make the story cleaner. Paper will be more likely to be accepted. And you, on the other hand, think, well, these analyses actually qualify the conclusions in important ways, and it might be misleading if we leave those out. Or it goes the opposite way, right? So you wrote a paper, it makes some nice large claims, and you're pretty happy with it, and you ask a friend to read it, and they kind of point out some pretty serious problems, and you look through it and you say, like, well, that's basically right, but if I did that, I wouldn't really have anything left to show. I'd have null results, and how could I get this published? Right? So it's sort of the opposite extreme, where in some sense now you're the bad guy, right? So like now doing the right thing has costs too. Different kind of situation is, this could be whether you're a student or faculty, right? A female student tells you that her male advisor has been making inappropriate comments. And so you think to yourself, like, obviously the right thing to do is to go talk to someone. And in certain jurisdictions, like in the United States, you might even be legally obligated to do that. But on the other hand, you might think to yourself, well, I mean, there's all like, do I want to get in the middle of this? It's going to be bad for the department, right? And so again, you have sort of different considerations pulling you in different directions. This is something that some flavor of this comes up very often for people writing grant proposals. You propose that you need to scan 200 subjects. Do you really need to scan new subjects? There's lots of data sets out there you might be able to reanalyze, but you're worried that if you say, hey, I just need money to reanalyze human connectome data or something, maybe that doesn't seem as sexy to the reviewers and you don't get the money. And so in a sense, you're basically asking for money you might not need, which could be used for other things, just because it makes you a little more fundable. Another very common situation, right, is like you're trying to do good reproducible research, and so you want to put the code online, but you kind of know that it doesn't work exactly as it is. You have to spend a lot more time to make it run start to finish, and you don't have that kind of time. So you live with the fact that maybe people actually won't be able to run this code, or will have to bang their own head against the wall. At the design stage, maybe you want to do some study that involves some fairly invasive intervention, and maybe you even need to deceive your participants about that, and it might generally disturb them, but you really think the knowledge to be gained here is important. So you have these sort of opposing values and desires. And lastly, this is by far the most common one, right? Like you have a p-value of 0.06. Oh God, no, what will I do? I have a p-value of 0.06. And there's all kinds of ways that we know you can turn a 0.06 value into something below 0.05. And so that's a very common source of sort of ethical tension in some sense, where on some level, the number is what it is. On another sense, that number has implications for how your work is received, et cetera. So again, these are just meant to be like sketches of situations that you probably have run into where you need to do something, but it's not you just trust your intuitions. I don't know. So you might think, okay, look, people study this kind of stuff, right? What do big ethical frameworks out there say? And you might expect they would have some bearing on that. So let's just very briefly review some of the sort of big players in this space. Like, what are the major ethical systems or theories? And many of you probably will have heard much of this before. You might have taken ethics classes in undergraduate or just done some reading. And so I'll just walk through a few of these, and I'll also give you sort of like the counter arguments for why they don't actually work. And you know, spoiler, none of them actually really work. And I'll talk about why in a second. So, you know, the kind of one of the two big views is sort of the ontology. So the idea here is that certain actions are just inherently good or bad, right? There's just rules. Now, there's wide differences about where those rules come from. They might come from the Bible, right, or from some other holy book or religion. They might come from just, you know, some innate knowledge we all carry with us, like maybe we just all feel that murder is wrong, right? And but the idea is that there's just some set of rules somehow, somewhere written into the universe that should govern how we behave. Some things are good, some things are bad. And that sounds fine, and that you might say, well, that's very intuitive, that yes, murder just is wrong, right? It's not the kind of thing you need to appeal to consequences to justify, et cetera. But the thing is, it doesn't really work in practice, right? So, okay, you have a rule that says murder is wrong. Great. Is murder always wrong, right? The classic example is like, what if someone gave you a chance to go back in time and kill Hitler? Is murder still wrong? And no system is flexible enough to account for that, right? You're not going to find like a tablet that says thou shalt not kill unless someone shows up and says, hey, we've got Hitler over here and we have the chance to go back and take him out. What do you think, right? So the flexibility still has to come from somewhere else. You have to be able to apply these laws, these moral laws somewhere, and humans are involved in that process. And even if there were moral laws, how would you know you're following them, right? Like, do you know that what you think, what you feel is right is actually sort of the moral truth? Maybe not. And so there are sort of deep problems with the deontological views. The other sort of big class of theories is what's called utilitarianism or consequentialism. And the general idea here is what makes something good or bad is its effect on the world. And so in general, most utilitarians will argue that we are seeking to maximize well-being in the population. And that potentially even includes future generations, right? So not just what makes people happy now, we also need to think about like what world are we living to future generations. And so in a sense, utilitarianism is sort of like a big computation, like the best action available to you in some sense is like the one that would create the most good for the most people. Now, this doesn't really work either because, well, one problem is like who gets to define well-being, right? Like if you could define it, how would you measure it? Like can you really actually measure like whether people are better off? It's hard. And even if you could do that, how do you actually compute it, right? Like good luck, even with like seemingly trivial decisions, there are unintended impacts, right? How do you know that like you decide to do this thing, like, you know, I'm going to share this data because I think it's better for the world, but maybe like somebody nefarious gets a hold of that data and does something totally unexpected, and now that was totally the wrong outcome, right? Impossible to tell. Also, it's easy to construct examples that violate people's intuitions, like slavery, right? If someone told you, we have really good reason to think that if we enslaved 10% of the population, that would like really benefit the other 90%. Most people are not going to say, okay, all right, I guess slavery is okay after all, right? So we all have, to some degree, deontological views, even if we think we're utilitarians. Another class of kind of views is relativist ethics. And here the idea is that like what makes something good or bad is just the context, typically sociocultural context. So, you know, like if everyone p-hacks, then p-hacking is okay, right? It's not bad if everyone does it. And the problem there, of course, is most of us want to think there are some sort of absolute moral standards. Like if we lived in a society where pedophilia was embraced, does that mean it's okay? Like should we look at societies that do things that we think are horrific and say, you know, not our business. You know, if people over there want to go around murdering each other, that's good, I guess, for them. Right? So there are problems there. Similar kind of flavor, you have pragmatism. What is good is that which people find useful. Okay, what if I find it really useful to lie, steal, and cheat my way into fame and fortune, right? How do we live our lives with that? And then like the super extreme view, which to be honest, I'm actually personally quite sympathetic to, well, I'm not gonna like try to defend or explain that, is skepticism, right? There aren't actually really any moral laws or truths at all. Such an idea is absurd. And again, even if you think that's true, like where does that leave you day to day? Like, what do I do with that? Okay, so like what, there's nothing to guide the decision of like what is good or bad. So that's a problem. So obviously, you know, this is like a 2-minute sketch. This is like a caricature, right? Like there's a lot more to be said about all these views. They're much more nuanced than I'm suggesting. And there's other views I didn't talk about. But I do think it's safe to say like that it's widely recognized that like all of these kind of schools of thought on like what makes something good or not have like deep flaws, arguably fatal flaws. And they don't work out of the box. They're not going to give you sort of automatic good decisions. You can find counterexamples easily in all cases. So do these kind of systems help, right? Is it helpful to actually think about like, you know, how ethicists or like how an ethical person should behave? You know, in a broad sense, the answer is obviously yes. So even though there are counterexamples, like we appeal to these kinds of principles all the time. So it's not like, you know, someone came up, like Kant came up with like deontological world ethics, and after that people started behaving a certain way, right? Like obviously the ethicists and philosophers have formalized what has been going on since time immemorial. We all appeal to these kinds of principles. So some examples. Privacy. Why do we care about participants' privacy? Well, you might have a deontological view and say people just have a fundamental human right to privacy. It's not up for debate, right? It's just an innate right. We have to respect that. You could argue for, let's say, diversity on consequentialist grounds. You might say, look, having a diverse faculty means that we have different perspectives and backgrounds, which promotes better ideas, understanding. We have all sorts of like inputs from different places, and it increases the quality of our science and our well-being, right? So that's a consequentialist argument. Diversity is not good in and of itself. It's what it does for us that makes it good. A relativist argument for you know, questionable practices is very common. It goes something like this. Look, these are the standards my community follows. If you don't like that I only reported 1 out of 3 of my measures, maybe you're in the wrong field, right? How dare you come and tell me that what I'm doing is wrong? This is the standard here. And it's interesting to know, right, that the same action can be justified generally in different ways. So privacy can be defended on consequentialist grounds. Look, if we don't take privacy concerns seriously, number one, people might not participate. Of course, there might also actually be serious impacts to them, right? We don't want the data to get out and people use that and people can suffer, right? So that's a consequentialist argument for privacy. Conversely, you might just say, look, diversity is inherently a good thing. It doesn't require any further justification. That's just a principle we believe in. Or you might have a consequentialist argument for why peak hacking is good. Actually, people have made this claim. That, you know, based on certain assumptions, you might be able to show that with a mathematical model, that some degree of cheating essentially promotes convergence in truth in the long run. And I think actually Russ alluded to this, right? Like what is the optimal balance between like false positives and false negatives? And it can vary. And the point is, clearly we are sensitive to these kinds of considerations, even if we don't necessarily sit down and like read books by ethicists and have a sort of very formalized way of thinking about this. We appeal to these kinds of intuitions about where ethics come from all the time. But the problem is, right, in other words, even if all that's true, like there's a gap, right? There's a big gap between like what some system of ethics might tell you makes something right and what you actually do in practice, right? Like the question, what is morally good, which is what all of the kind of things we just talked about address, is quite different from like, how can I, as a human being in this particular context on this day, know which of these two things to do, right? Like, great, so consequentialism, maybe you believe in that. That's what makes an action good, is its consequences. But that helps you not at all unless you're able to compute the actual consequence, you know, what is this action promote utility more than that one, which we generally can't do except in some fairly narrow cases. And to be fair, proponents of these ethical systems recognize this. I'm not saying like, oh, ethicists are idiots. They have all these ideas, but they're worthless. No, I mean, people recognize, like even people who first proposed like utilitarian ideas recognize, like in practice, obviously you can't sit down and do like a giant universal computation. That's not the goal. The goal is to articulate like what in principle would make something good or bad. So how do we actually navigate day-to-day moral problems? Really, who knows, right? I mean, that's in some ways a question of psychology more than anything else. Not to say that there's lots of people have tried to approach that question in various ways, but again, we only have now less than an hour here, so I'm not going to try to unpack, like, you know, and it's not my expertise in any case, like, you know, how people actually decide what to do when they face moral decisions. But what we do know is what people tell us, is how they explicitly justify their decisions, like what they say led them to do what they did. And I want to focus in particular on one kind of theme that comes up a lot in science in particular, which is that many of the problems we face pit our own interest against those of others, right? Which is to say, you know, very commonly, the course of action that seems to benefit us maximally is not necessarily the one that benefits other people, right? Now, I sort of frame that implicitly from a utilitarian perspective, But even if you come at this from a deontological perspective, most moral systems will say something like, it's not good to take advantage of other people, right? Or like you should care more about other people than about yourself, et cetera. So on most systems of ethics, you end up with this sort of dilemma, like what benefits me is not what, in some sense, I think the right thing to do is. And this is obviously true to some degree everywhere, right, in all domains of life, but I think it's particularly salient in a domain like science because in some sense, the justification for setting up this whole edifice, right, the system that gives people money and careers to do work that they find interesting is really ultimately to help and benefit society. It's not like you're working in retail where like, it's not like you think you're like, the point of your job is not to benefit humanity in any way, right? You pay your debt to society via taxes, which is, I should say, a perfectly reasonable attitude to have. Might argue maybe more scientists should have that attitude. But we tend to think of science as having sort of like something, there's some more noble aspiration there. And so you end up with this conflict because a lot of what benefits us as scientists, maybe not exactly what benefits the broader scientific community or the public. So it's particularly interesting to look at these kinds of situations because and ask, when we justify our actions, in particular when we believe that we're doing something that's normatively wrong, but we do it anyway. And I want to emphasize, I'm not taking any stand at all at any point in this talk on like what is the right thing to do. I'm saying whatever you happen to believe, right? There will be situations where you think like this is the right thing to do in some sense, but I'm kind of going to do this other thing. Right? So I'm not appealing to like some normative standard. Really just saying like when you approach this, like you might have views about what is the right thing to do and still not always do that. So how do we justify this, right? This is a very common scenario for scientists. Like Twitter is full of people saying like, oh, the incentive's this, and that. What do I do? And what's really interesting about this is very few people will say explicitly as a justification, like, look, I did it because it benefits me, right? Like you would probably be a little worried if like you ask your colleague, why they like made up data or something, and their answer was, well, because obviously it's easier to get the paper published out, right? That's like, it's true, but that's not a justification. We don't think, like, we sort of expect people not to prioritize, at least not exclusively, their own interest above everything else. And so we come up, I'm not saying like we're lying to ourselves, but we have justifications for actions that clearly aren't just like, you didn't do it, it benefits me, that's why I did it. So let's look at some of these justifications that we give. And I want to emphasize, I'm not saying these are wrong. And much of the time, maybe the vast majority of the time, they are accurate representations of why we do things and they're reasonable. So this is just a descriptive summary. One thing you hear very commonly, look, it's not my job to worry about that, right? Like I'm paid to do science. I'm not the IRB. There is a reason there is an IRB. Like I describe my experiment and they get to think about whether or not this is problematic. And then they tell me. And it's just not efficient for me to start thinking about myself as like, I am God now and I have to make decisions that impact other people, et cetera. I just do my job in a local context. Other people worry about the implications. Or, like I'm not the department chair, I'm not the funder, et cetera. It's someone else's job to make that kind of decision. Everyone else does the same thing, right? Super common. And in some sense, it's hard to argue with it. Like if everyone in your community does this thing, why should you hold yourself to the higher standard? Is it fair for anyone else to come along and say, yeah, sure, I know everyone else does it, but you shouldn't do it? Right? That's a reasonable defense. There aren't enough hours in the day, sort of related to the first point. Like it's reasonable to say, look, yes, I recognize that's a problem in principle, but I just don't have enough time. Right? Like there's always more you could do. You can always be better. You can always do things more cleanly, more accurately. But look, we're all human and we have to sleep and eat and take care of our kids, et cetera. So you do what's reasonable. Another kind of argument is, look, if I don't do this, someone worse will, right? Like, yes, I'm p-hacking. Yes, I'm going to get the paper published this way. But if I don't do it, someone else who doesn't even think this is a bad thing will come along. They'll get the job. And that's worse for everybody, right? So that's why it's like, I'm actually noble here. I'm doing the right thing because I know that this is bad. And I'm just doing some kind of calculation about like, what's good for us all in the long run. Maybe you think you have no power. Like, yeah, sure, I could go and talk to someone about like this person's comments. But if I do that, what's really going to happen, right? No one's going to pay any attention to me. They'll just like retaliate. And so, everyone loses. Very common concern is like, I'm just not rewarded for doing the right thing. Like, you can't expect me like to sacrifice myself on the altar of the right thing just because it is the right thing, right? I mean, like maybe somebody else should go about setting up incentives that promote the kind of behavior we actually want from people. And the flip side is also true, right? Like, yeah, of course, I could like not oversell these findings, or I could go out and try and acquire a much more diverse sample, but like that would take so long, or my paper wouldn't get accepted, and it's just way harder, and my career would suffer. So I'm not going to do it. And another one that's, I think, a little different is like, just like sometimes, again, totally legitimate, like some things are just hard to think about, right? It can be painful to think about like the fact that maybe this thing that you're doing is not optimal and has consequences for other people. And it's not unreasonable to say, look, I know that on some level, I know that this is bad, but like, I just can't deal with it, right? Like I would go to pieces if I had to actually start thinking about these kind of things. Again, I'm human, I'm flawed, fine, but like, this is how I maintain my mental health and go about my business. And I think that's reasonable. And related to several of these, actually, you might also say, look, again, I agree that's important, but I have other priorities, right? So like, again, like there are only so many hours in the day. Yes, I think the things you just mentioned are important. I agree, but they're not like number one on my list, right? I have other values that I'm more worried about. Maybe I'm not super worried about like whether someone's data will get out and be misused. Not that I don't think that's important. I just think it's not as important as other things, and it's just too many things to worry about. So are these good justifications? I think the answer is like, obviously, sure, much of the time they are, but sometimes they're not, right? There are cases where we probably are fooling ourselves. Do we feel reasonably confident when we give these kind of justifications that they're actually capturing something real about like our assessment of the situation? One of the reasons why we might be skeptical, at least some of the time, is that we are very good at constructing these kind of justifications on the fly, right? As I mentioned, like we do this almost automatically. And it's kind of interesting because like if you imagine like someone coming to you and describing in 30 seconds a problem, here's the kind of data I'm working with, and I'm worried that this will potentially hurt participants, or like there's deception, and you might find yourself very quickly appealing to some situation like, oh yes, I'll tell you what to do in that situation. This is the right thing. And we're incredibly good at coming up with these kinds of moral judgments, right? Often with high confidence. But you kind of have to worry if, like, absent a context, you can do that. Like, what makes you think you're not doing the same thing fairly consistently when you're talking about yourself? So we could be fooling ourselves a lot. And kind of Russ Bolderak talked about this already, right? The idea that you kind of want to try and avoid that. And the question then is like, how would you know when your justifications are unsound? That's really sort of, I think, the modest thing that we can maybe like hope to achieve a little. It's like, are there sort of ways to know when our justifications are unsound? And really the only kind of suggestion I have here, which will not surprise probably anybody, but we'll unpack it anyways. We can think about our moral sort of dilemmas and choices like scientists, right? We can ask ourselves, like, is there actually evidence for the outcomes that we are worried about that might happen? When we say things like, if I don't p-hack, my paper won't get published, is that actually true, right? Like, if this were a scientific question, and some people do approach this like explicitly as a scientific question in the research, there's data that could speak to that, right? Like, there could be data that would suggest, like, actually, yes, the impact of this decision is likely to be big or not. And just asking ourselves questions and questioning our assumptions, I think, can be quite helpful. So here are the kinds of questions that we can ask ourselves. When you start to think about, not when you kind of develop like a tunnel vision, you're like, well, if I do this, then this will happen, that's bad, so I have to do this other thing. Do you have any evidence for that assumption, right? Like, is there actually good reason to think that if you, is it really that deterministic? Like, if you make this choice, this thing will happen, and that's bad. Is your assessment of how severe the consequences will be if this happens accurate? Like, okay, so if you don't get that paper published, let's say, does that mean your career is over? I don't know, maybe not. But it's worth exploring. We tend to focus on like extreme outcomes, right? Like, and when you kind of hold in your mind, like, this is the outcome if I do this, worst case, and this is the outcome if I don't. But the worst case is not necessarily the most interesting case. Like, if the worst case is super improbable, then maybe the worst case is not really what you should be worrying about, right? Maybe you should worry about like plausible cases, plausible outcomes. There also may be other courses of action we're not considering that would better align our incentives. So it's easy to fall into the trap of like thinking dichotomously about the problem. Like, I do this or I don't do this. Like, I put the data online or I don't put the data online. I try to decode people's thoughts and feelings using this algorithm or I don't. I p-hack or I don't. There may be actually ways that align your own incentives better with the people around you. And so I wanted to give like one just example of how that might play. Actually, sorry, before that, let me just point out, right? So like the one important point here is that this is not an appeal to altruism. Like I'm not, obviously, I do think we should appeal to altruism. We should say like, you know, to the extent that is reasonable and feasible, you should try to do the right thing. However, that's not the appeal here. I'm not saying like, you know, hey, have you ever considered doing the right thing? Like, is this like a completely novel concept to you? Right? Clearly not. The point is, consider that you might actually be losing out because you framed the problem in a way that's not optimal, and maybe some of the assumptions you're making have led you to construe the problem in a way that is actually not sort of beneficial to you, not to other people, but even just to you. So again, just think about your moral problems, your ethical dilemmas scientifically. And I wanted to kind of just give an example that's sort of salient to ECRs because early career researchers, because I think probably many people watching this have had something like this thought before. I know, and I certainly have, it does not just early career research, this happens all the time. I know that X and Y can be whatever you want, any kind of questionable research practice. I know these aren't great practices, but if I don't do them, I won't get to publish this paper in a good journal. If I don't get a paper in a good journal, I don't get a job. If I don't get a job, I can't do research. And it's very easy at that point to justify this on almost any kind of ethical framework, right? Like it's not, if you think you do good research, right, and believe in doing the right thing, then you should want to stay in other people should want you to stay in academia and research. And so how could you not cut corners in this way because it's what benefits both you and other people, right? But maybe that's not always a reasonable way to frame the issue. And it's the framing here that we can maybe take issue with a little bit. So if this is sort of you, and it certainly has been me, and continues to be me many times, some kinds of questions you might want to ask yourself are the following. Like, okay, how much do you think that like reporting, only the measure that worked instead of like 8 measures that you actually analyzed will increase the likelihood of publication? It might not be as big as you think, right? If you've been through the review process a bunch of times, you kind of know that like it's pretty random, right? Like the things you expect reviewers to pick on often are not at all what they care about. So maybe you're wrong. And at the very least, the world is probably not as deterministic as you think it is. Also, there might be a cost to aiming very high. So like in some fields in particular, it's maybe not so true of neuroimaging, but there's fields of biology, for example, where there really is this mentality of like, you don't get a Cell, Nature, or Science paper, you don't have a job. But the thing is, when you frame it that way, you're not thinking of all the people who tried really hard to get a science paper and failed. And because they spent so long trying to get that one paper into this like high prestigious, high impact journal, got nothing else published. Those cases happen. You might know people like that, right? Didn't go to get into science, went to PNAS rejected it, etc. You spent a lot of time. Maybe you could have just sent the paper to like PLOS One or something, and you would have had like 3 papers in the same amount of time. And hiring committees like people with more papers too. So there are costs to sort of what might initially seem like sort of high value strategies. How much difference does this one paper really make to your job prospect, right? Like, is it really the case that like this will be the thing that makes or breaks you? Like, you have 6 papers and the 7th really is the determining factor. Committees will love you if you would with that paper. Again, I don't know. I mean, maybe yes, maybe no, but you have to weight that in context. Like, the odds are in some sense pretty low to begin with, right? So does the one paper make that much of a difference? You also might lose some jobs because hiring committees see that you did X and Y, and maybe they don't like that, right? Increasingly, I think many people are taking these kinds of considerations seriously in terms of research integrity, reproducibility, et cetera. Also generalizability, right? You might increasingly run into committees that are actually worried about the fact that you didn't go out, you just like sampled white, rich, liberal undergrads at your university and took no steps at all to ensure that your results generalize, right? So yeah, it's more work, but maybe you actually should think about that, again, even just selfishly, because it does or might benefit you. What impact do you think in the long-term publishing work or doing things that you're not super thrilled about will have on your reputation, right? Like there is a short-term, long-term trade-off for these things. Even longer, do you want to spend the next 30 years of your life working next to people who expect you to do the things they hired you for, right? Like if you publish certain papers and people give you jobs for those things, they might expect that this is what you'll keep doing once you show up and that's what they'll tenure you for, et cetera. So another kind of consideration. And finally, let's take, and this I think is like super salient to a lot of people. Again, I recognize like many people here are not in this situation, but I do think there probably are a lot of grad students watching this and thinking about these issues. What happens if I don't get an academic job? And what's really, I think, striking about this, I've talked to a lot of early career researchers about this. And I like to ask people like, okay, think of all the people you know who either voluntarily left academia or didn't make it and had to go into industry. Just do like some mental integration. Do you think those people are like on average less happy than they were before? And almost always the answer is no. Like, yes, some people are happier, some people are less happy. Not clear that that's because they had to switch career, right? And most people are aware of that. I think like when you think about it, it seems kind of obvious that like most people don't like suffer drastically because they had to leave academia. But like, why are you special then, right? Like from the inside, it often feels to us like, okay, but it would be horrible if I had to leave. Framing it that way and sort of thinking like, am I really that different from all the people I know who seem perfectly satisfied making, you know, twice as much money and having 40-hour work weeks? Is that such a bad thing? And the point of all this is not, I'm not trying to be clear, I'm not trying to argue that like you should always do the right thing or like that like in some utilitarian calculation like this, it's actually always good to do the thing that's like, you know, noble, et cetera. That's not the claim at all. I'm just saying that thinking about these kind of considerations might change the calculus, right? You might think, look, actually, yeah, it's nothing terrible would happen to me if I did something else. So I may as well try and do research the way I think it should be done. And if it doesn't work out, you know, odds were not that great in the first place. Like that's the reality, right? Like it's hard to get an academic job to begin with. And this particularly should be salient to you, this last point, because, you know, part of the reason I think the kinds of skills that we try to teach in the NeuroHackademy are so important is because if you're an early career researcher and you have data science skills and you have reasonable programming skills, a lot of opportunities are opened up to you, right? So certainly your research will benefit as well, right? So you will be able to do better research and ask questions you can't ask. But there are implications for what kind of jobs you can get if you don't end up in academia, either because you choose to leave or because, you know, you don't get a job. And so it really is, I think, to not everyone's, nothing is to everyone's benefit, but to most people's benefit, I think, if you are in a position where you're sort of asking like, you know, what does the future hold? And you have the time and the inclination, I think it's a really good idea to spend time on developing these kind of technical skills because they will almost certainly help you in the long run, no matter where you end up. Now, I'm almost done. I do kind of want to mention one other thing, which is sort of what I think goes like some meta-ethical consideration. I started, there's like a little subtitle at the beginning of the first slide, right? It's like, you know, the case for more introspection, most of the time for some people, some of the time to some degree. And it is always the case, I think, that any kind of advice like this should be taken with a grain of salt because like good advice is like, and maybe it's right 54% of the time. Like there's nothing that is like applicable to everyone all the time. And in particular, I'm sensitive to the fact that like there are lots of people for whom I think this whole talk is probably actually not only a waste of time, but actively harmful in the sense that some people are already super inclined to obsess about like, am I a good person because I do this? Should I do this? Should I do that, right? And so the same principle could be applied to the question of whether you should even be thinking about these kind of questions, right? And in a sense, this is sort of like related to, for those of you who either have been in therapy or are training or trained as clinical, as clinicians of some kind, right? This is almost like cognitive structure, right? Like you can ask yourself, like, look, the decision I'm facing here, it might seem really big, but it's just one small decision on one day in one life on one planet, right? Like, does it really make me like a bad person if I get this wrong? Can I even be expected to get it right given how limited information I have? It's a really nice day outside. Maybe I should just go for a walk and just not worry about this, right? So I don't want to leave you with the impression that like, you know, I'm saying that we're all horrible people unless we spend time thinking about these, et cetera. And like, for many people, the opposite is true, right? There's lots of people who probably should actually worry less. You know, they're doing just fine as is and maybe like obsessing over like what to do in every situation is not optimal. So that's the caveat, which is, and I think this goes without saying, I figured I'd mention, like, no suggestion, no practical advice is ever good for, you know, all or often even most people most of the time, right? You sort of weigh your own personal situation. So I do want to leave time for questions. Let me just conclude just by summarizing. So there is a sense in which I think, you know, ethical problems arise a lot in science, and a certain class of problems in particular that arises is one that sort of pits us against everyone else in some sense, right? It's unfortunate, but it does happen. And we all have different intuitions, beliefs, ethical systems. Again, I don't want to take any position at all here on like, you know, this is the right way to think about what we're doing here. For all I know, some of you have no, you know, you might be completely immoral, and statistically, actually, probably, you know, like a few of the people watching this are psychopathic, right? Like, this is all like, what does this even mean? Like, do whatever's in your best interest, and so it goes. We're not going to like take a stand on any of these issues here. The point I want to make is that I think for most people, a little bit of dispassionate reflection on what we're feeling and our motives and our assumptions can sometimes be helpful, right? And again, not because it's the right thing to do. This is not an appeal to like the better angels of our nature, but because it might actually help you find ways that better align your belief system and your goals in life with the demands and constraints of the world around you, right? So it's easy to get sucked into thinking that the way the problem is like handed to you, right? Like if you don't do this, well, this is sort of the right thing to do. But we all know that actually what benefits you personally is this other thing, right? Often that framing is actually just not accurate. It's just very unlikely that like these kind of off-the-shelf pieces of advice people give you, like you need to publish in this journal, otherwise your career is down the drain. There's just no reason to think that that kind of off-the-shelf advice can apply, just to every case that comes along, right? Every case is different, and even statistically, we don't generally have very good data for a lot of the kind of the advice that people offer. So I think once in a while, it's good to sit down and just like question the assumptions surrounding the sort of the framing that you're facing. All right, so I'll stop there and take questions about any of that or any other issues. I'm also happy to talk about general career issues, because this is probably the best time in terms of the schedule. I mean, if people are thinking about like considerations about their future, et cetera. So let me take a look. So for only one question, and I already mentioned I will share the slides after this. Any other thoughts, comments? Okay, so the question is, how do you position yourself well for an industry job? That's a good question. And I think, again, like the cheap but accurate answer is it depends, right? So I think it depends on what kind of alternate career contemplating. I will say that if you are taking like this material, if you come away at the end of this week, or if you already have strong programming skills, you should not be very worried, right? Like, I'm not saying you'll get a wonderful job, it's like perfect, but like there is a serious shortage of developers almost everywhere around the world. And so if you have good technical skills, you're probably already pretty well positioned. Again, I can't promise anything, but like it's much easier to find a job, I will say, in industry, broadly speaking, in tech, for example, than in academia. Now, if you want to do certain kinds of research in industry, that can be a little bit harder, right? So I don't have a simple answer, but I will say that in general, like pursuing technical skills is a good one. Another question, this is a good one, this comes up a lot, but what do you do if your advisor is unwilling to do the right thing? That's a really difficult question, right? And again, I think that there's no simple answer. You kind of have to weigh many of the kinds of considerations I mentioned. So like, are there ways you could frame the issue to your advisor that might make them more, viewed more positively? Like, could you say, look, here's some evidence that actually people do value this kind of work, and that there are actually benefits to taking this approach. And also, maybe your fears aren't founded, and it's just, you could ask them, like, okay, do you actually have data to suggest that, like, if I don't do this, the paper won't get published? So that's one. You could, depending on what department, you could go talk to the graduate student advisor and explain your concerns. Now, obviously, that's can be complicated, right? Faculty or friends, et cetera, but that is, in theory, the job of the graduate student advisor is to answer these kinds of questions. You could consider looking at other advisors, or you maybe just start collaborating with someone else. You could try to bring someone else into the collaboration. You might push back. So I'm afraid I don't really have an easy answer. It's a difficult problem, and there is this power differential. And so, and of course, like sometimes you just say, look, I bite the bullet now, and I'll do the right thing later. That's fine, though. Be aware that like that has a habit of sort of, it's very easy to start kicking the can down the road. Like when I get a job, when I get tenure, et cetera. So. Yeah, so it's a really important question, but unfortunately one that's hard to give an answer to. Let's see. Do you have any suggestions for digestible philosophy intro? I think the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is great. Most of the articles on there, I think, are really pretty good overviews, and there's lots of articles on ethical theories and philosophy in general. So that would be my recommendation. I'm not so sure about the intersection between science and ethical systems. It's not something that I've thought a whole lot about. guess. I'm sorry, I know we have to probably stop in like 10, actually probably, yeah, I'm just trying to find questions that are not super long to read. I always struggle with this: if I leave academia, I will likely not be able to come back. That's an excellent question. It varies by discipline, right? So like in computer science, actually, for example, people come and go fairly regularly, and actually having worked in industry is often seen as a plus in some areas. In neuroscience and psychology, I recognize that's generally not the case, and yes, it can be hard. So that's, I think, actually a pretty good, the advice I often give to postdocs in fields where it is hard to come back is basically, look, as long as you're okay with going into industry, and this isn't like you're only, you're trying to see, like, there's no harm in like doing a postdoc and trying to stick it out. And if it doesn't work, as good as something else. But it is true that it's hard to go, it's hard to in many fields to move in the other direction. If you know that your research results could be misused or used in a diverse way of people who are not sharing moral values, is it better to address those possible misuses to try to limit them in your paper, or is that like opening Pandora's box? That is a really, really excellent question, really hard, and I'm going to cop out and say it's really case by case, right? So I will say I'm not a believer. Some people have the view that like everything is okay, right? You talk about everything because we're scientists and like and the truth is the only thing that matters. I do think there are actually questions that maybe scientists should not ask. But it's hard to make generalizations. I think that like it depends on what the question is, what the perceived implications are. But I think there can be situations for sure where, yeah, maybe you don't want to open Pandora's box. I do think, like, I will say that where I personally get uncomfortable is where people misrepresent science because they're worried about the consequences, right? So I think it's okay to say, look, we're just not going to talk about that because we don't like where this might lead. It's, I think, ethically questionable, I think at least, to basically say ends justify the means arguments. Like, we know this isn't really true, or that's maybe a little bit of a bastardization of the science, but it's really important that we make people think this, right? That, I think, is sort of a little sketchy. But saying, like, don't talk about this, nothing would come of it, I think that's actually, there are questions like that, I think, potentially. There's significant push or pressure towards pursuing academia ones in a PhD program. Are there structured spaces that you know about that talk about approaches to pursuing industry positions? I do not, and actually I'm a little bit ashamed to say that. I feel like I should, but I'm sure there are some. And so actually a really good thing to do maybe would be to start a Slack channel if people feel comfortable talking about that. If not, maybe you could just set up like a private thing somewhere else where people can join. So yeah, I would definitely encourage you to talk about it because there should be, and there probably are things out like that. So maybe other people can point to those kinds of resources. But I'm glad that you asked that. How should an ECR ethically and effectively criticize other ECRs who may be practicing science in ethically questionable ways? I mean, these are all excellent questions, but they're all tough, and they're all sort of, I kind of want to say, like, it depends. There's sort of two ways to think about it. One is like, there's like the don't punch down view, which is like, don't criticize other people at your level, or, well, I mean, not at, but below, or if you're ECRs, I guess you could say that, both of you have very little power, maybe. I'm not sure I agree with that. I think, my particular view, which was maybe different from other people's, is I don't know that you shouldn't go out of your way, obviously, to pick on people because they're below you. That's bad. But it would be very strange if we avoid criticizing, people who, or papers or work that we think has problems because of, or that, whatever the case. That means, like, if you're an ECR, like, you can publish whatever you want and nobody should criticize you because of a power differential. Like, that's a problem. So you obviously should be sensitive to the fact that someone is early in their career and frame it in a way that maybe they can adapt to and respond productively. But I personally would say, like, I don't think you should avoid criticizing someone just because they're early in their career. Arguably, that's exactly when you should, right? Because you have a teaching opportunity. But we, of course, be aware, as with anyone, they might not be responsive. And that's the point at which you might say, look, okay, I said what I have to say. Beyond that, it's on you. Are there ethical standards for talking about authorship order when collaborators disagree on levels of contribution? These are all like really fantastic questions. I kind of feel like I should write them down so I can use them like in other contexts as examples. I don't know that there are any like, well, so I have seen sort of guidelines from various labs for like, and so one thing people do, which I think is really good to do if you have like situations where there's many collaborators, is lay out a guide ahead of time. Like, here are my expectations for like how credit gets assigned. It's good to have that conversation up front, ethical considerations aside, right? Like even just like pragmatically, like it's easier to have conversations like this, I think, up front than to wait until people are, because often people get upset and feel like they did more than other people think they did, right? That's very common. So I don't know if I would say there's ethical standards. I would say like practically it's a good idea to develop some internal guide. And even if it's uncomfortable a little bit, maybe bring it up, right? So I personally, and I'm sure it makes people a little uncomfortable, but I will say, you know, when starting collaboration, like, look, and I say like, I don't expect to be handed authorship unless I make a contribution. And by the same token, like if you just send me some data, you're not going to be an author, right? I will give you the opportunity to contribute. So those kind of sort of having a protocol up front, I think is helpful. But the reality is people do have different expectations and views. And so that's, to some degree, conflict is probably unavoidable and you just have to kind of navigate it as best you can. Maybe I'll take, how are we doing here? I'll take one more, I guess. I'm wondering about balancing pragmatism and ethics. Open science practices suggest we should publish all analysis we run and that it's ethical to do so, but of course you also have to maintain a narrative that's clear, targeted, and cogent. I wonder if including every analysis would cause a paper to lose the thread. But if you just store analysis, supplementary material, et cetera, people may think you're hiding. Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent point. I will once again say it depends, right? I think it's true. Like nobody wants to read a paper that's like 300 pages with no narrative. I think narrative is super important. The way I personally approach this is the following. And this is hard because obviously we have self-serving biases, and so we might fool ourselves. But I kind of, the way I think about it is like, okay, I will, you know, if I feel like this data point isn't legitimately not going to change the way someone views my research. Like it's not that I'm trying to hide it. It's not that, in other words, would I care if somebody else didn't put it in the main text, right? And if the answer is no, then I'm okay with it. Like if I don't think this is actually super informative, it's just a supplementary thing, then I don't talk about it. If, on the other hand, even if it's a small detail, if I think like actually this could change the way that the reader interprets what I'm saying, then I will put it in. Right? So that's, I think, one way to approach it. I'm not saying it's the only way or the best way. The reality at the end of the day is like, you know, we're probably not going to get away from supplementary materials because it is important to provide context without overwhelming the reader. So I think the important thing is to think about like, you know, you want to be honest with yourself and with the reader. As long as you sort of really gave it your best shot to identify the pieces that would change the conclusion, the interpretation, then I think it's fine to put stuff in the supplement or somewhere else. Okay, so let's I guess call it quits for now. But I'm happy to answer these kinds of questions or related ones in Slack. So feel free to message me or just ask in the channel. So thank you all for listening, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the course.